Oh, it's all you.
Thank you. Thank you. Can everyone hear me enough? Is that good? Is that good? Or shall I do microphone? This is good. I tend to shout a lot, so I think this is probably fine. Yes. So, I'm very much a typographer. I'm not a type designer, like most of you here, but I'm really a user of the typefaces that many of you design as part of my work. So as well as a kind of concept, a layout, a typeface choice, or choices, I pay particular attention to typesetting of any piece of text. So intrinsic values or features of a piece of typography are present in the characters themselves, their shapes, the character set, number of weights, and this is type design, with these shapes and values defined by the type designer. Extrinsic values are what can be achieved with the characters, such as their arrangement in typeset paragraphs. And again, these are defined by the graphic designer, and they're changeable. And they're changeable on both a micro typographic level, so that would be things like letter and word spacing and hyphenation settings, and they're also changeable on a macro typography level, which is how these lines are arranged on a page, how they relate to each other in terms of hierarchy, etc., etc. For this really short presentation, I'm going to focus on micro typography and kind of my small findings within that. So again, unjustified setting is a kind of relatively new convention in the history of typography. It's where the space between each letter is consistent, as opposed to justified setting where the words or letter space is expanded or contracted to form an even right-hand, left-hand page. We all know this, but I have to mention it. It's the convention really to use one or the other. Maybe you might use centered typography in short text. You'd never use range right. Very, very, very exceptional. But I always ask myself, could justified and unjustified ever be combined? And I kind of never thought it could be, but here's a definition. Unjustified and justified at the same time refers to a situation where an action, a belief, or a decision appears to be wrong or not supported by evidence on the surface, but due to hidden circumstances or complexities, could also be considered somewhat reasonable or defensible, creating a paradoxical feeling of being both justified and unjustified, depending on the full perspective. So my question is, I suppose, can we apply that to typography? Visual Communication, Architecture and Painting was a book written and designed by Herbert Bayer in 1967, published by Reinhold and Studio Vista, and it really collected Bayer's reflection on all three subjects brought together at the end of a long career as a kind of descriptive monograph. And it's very tempting for you, I'd like to encourage you to read what's on the screen. The graphic designer today seems to feel that the typographic means at his or her disposal have been exhausted. A wish for new excitement is in the air. New styles are hopefully expected to appear. This is what he writes. But again, I want you to focus on the typesetting. Really focus on the typesetting. You might initially notice that the book is set in lowercase, a theory often put forward by Bayer, who wrote in the book, Why do we write and print with two different alphabets simultaneously? We do not speak a capital A and a small a. You might also notice a double space after each full stop to signal a new sentence. Again, a reasonable convention to highlight that a new sentence is beginning if a capital letter is not being used. But if you focus again, you might notice that the text setting appears to be a mixture of unjustified and justified setting happening in the same paragraph at the same time. even though Bayer states actually in the book itself that the text is set unjustified. So what is this type of typesetting? Why was it done? What does it mean? Are there any other examples that do similar things? And can we learn anything from this? Forward to Bayer in the book. Here we go. On page 21, Bayer claims that the first known application of flush left was designed in 1926 during his time at the Bauhaus. And this method of setting type has been used throughout the text pages of this book, but clearly not supported by the evidence of the previous slide. He also implies that letter spacing produces misleading emphasis. So I'll just try and explain what's going on here for those that need some explanation. So the text is justified, but if the last word of a line doesn't fit on that line, it's taken over to the next line, but the line above remains unjustified, or range left, or flush left, or left aligned. These things are often called many things. To me, it's totally logical as an idea, but it's totally weird. It's totally not explained anywhere. There's no hyphenation of words, apart from those that contain hyphens, such as hand in hand. And it's a really novel form that I've never seen before or after in print. It actually really works well. You know, I had this book for a couple of years, and I didn't really notice until I really started reading it. And I kind of fallen in love with this form of typesetting. But currently, it's not possible to achieve this in current layout software because continuous text is thought of as a paragraph and not lines. So two different types of setting cannot be attached to one paragraph. Well, certainly in InDesign. I don't know about other places. So my design practice that I run in London acts as a kind of live laboratory with what I'm researching, getting test-driven and fed straight back into my work in real time. So this type of setting, you know, I kind of immediately hijacked it and started doing it for publications. This is the first example, which was for a catalogue called Horror in the Modernist Block in 2023. And purely it's a visual parody. I'm not really understanding what it was. And I'm using hard returns to take over lines that would not justify. So they become range left. And the result is exactly the same as Bayer's system. But in reality, it's several fake paragraphs joined together. It was really inefficient to do, as I had to decide where to break the line, so it became a real kind of manual, labor-intensive process. And of course, any corrections throws everything out. The typesetters of the book, credited as graphic arts typographers, had published with the same publishers in New York a specimen of type 2 years previously in 1965. On the left is visual communication, the Bayer's book. On the right is a specimen page of Folio Grotesque Light, designed by Conrad Bayer and Walter Böhm, released with the Bauer Font Foundry in 1957. So I can work out what the font is by overlaying them together. I can work out the precise size, I can work out who typeset it, I can work out how it was printed. And I've really put that in because I thought that at type design conferences, people like to see overlapping type. So it doesn't really have any relevance, but I thought you might like it. It doesn't really give me any answers finding the specimen. Surely the typesetting wasn't a mistake that no one's noticed for 50 years apart from me. No one's mentioned it for 50 years, so I can't find anything about it. But it feels really intentional, and it feels like a natural decision based on not wanting to hyphenate words. Because if the setting was fully justified, the gaps or rivers of white would be huge. I looked for correspondence in Bayer's archive in the special collections of Denver Public Library, but drew a complete blank. There's no documentation. So just some kind of brief history. This is a book from 1470 by Nicholas Jensen, printed in Venice, and it's an early example of a book set justified, in movable metal type, that does not contain any paragraph separation. So again, this has been the norm in books of continuous text since this time, and is still the norm today. The history, the social, political, and theoretical aspects of unjustified setting versus justified setting has been really well covered in part by Robin Kim Ross in Unjustified Text in the Zero Hour, which was originally published in Information Design Journal, but was reprinted in his book Unjustified Text. And also by Paul Stiff, with his brilliant essay, The End of the Line, a survey of unjustified typography, which is in Information Design Journal from 1996. So 1931, Eric Gill, in his essay in typography, composed the text like a scribe writing lines of unequal length, as opposed to a compositor setting justified lines. When the text didn't fit well on one line, he would switch to a smaller size as a form of kind of superscript abbreviation. And you can see that on the 10th line, the word because. He even increased or reduced the word spacing of individual lines to create a more even or semi-justified effect. You can see that in the line, compare the white spacing on the line of commercialization to the tight spacing in the next line, beginning great powers. We can call this semi-justified setting. It wasn't really until after the Second World War that more examples of unjustified text started to appear and to sort of gain a bit of traction. Here's Max Bill, who was the author and designer of Uber typography from 1946. William Sandberg, the Dutch designer and director of the Stedelijk Museum in Amsterdam, produced over 250 catalogues, the majority with unjustified setting. In his article, Must Line Length Be Uniform? In Typographica from 1952, he writes, the setting of lines in text of uneven length and departure from the rectangular form mean that the text matter will assume a dynamic instead of static character. You also notice that the left-hand page of his article is justified and the right-hand page is unjustified. So you kind of could claim that this is an example of unjustified and justified text at the same time, in the same article, but not within the same paragraph. So it doesn't quite count. Of course, this mix happens today in printed newspapers to signify a different type of article appearing on the same page. This is The Guardian from last month. Dieter Rott designed an issue of the Icelandic literary journal, Bertinga, in 1957 that seems unjustified. Rott had ended up in Reykjavik via Germany, Switzerland, and Denmark, and was one of the founders of Spiral, a literary and visual art journal in Switzerland that had switched to unjustified setting by issue number 4 in 1954. But on closer inspection, the type is set justified and unjustified in the same paragraph. The longer lines being justified. So if you compare the 3 lines marked in red, you should be able to see. So I suppose my question to myself is, why was this done and how was this done? My only possible explanation was that Rott did specify unjustified type, but the compositor just justify the long lines on the monotype machine because that's what was done at the time. I can't imagine that ROT would specify justified and unjustified setting. But I don't know. Another place to look for potential images, or examples, was within concrete poetry in the 1960s. Opening the Cage by Edwin Morden. It's based on a quote from John Cage, who said, "I have nothing to say, and I am saying it, and that is poetry." Each line rearranged 14 times to create the poem. Word spaces are replaced with tabs, and at first glance, it seems to be justified and unjustified at the same time, as the majority of the lines end in "it." But again, it doesn't quite make the cut, because I'm sure you'll notice there's an "is" in there on the 9th line. So in fact, it's unjustified, but it's pretty close. My search continues. Lust, written and designed on a golf ball typewriter by the artist and writer Paul Buck in 1976, is of interest as it uses contextual indent paragraph setting, where the end of the paragraph signifies horizontally the position of the following paragraph. I've written about this method extensively in my PhD thesis that you can read online. A monospace golf ball typewriter was used as the method of composition, with each character taking up the same amount of horizontal space. These indicated lines show the line endings, that they just happen to be the same number of characters, so they appear justified. Of course, I'm thinking, is there a text where each line is the same number of characters? This is a book called Diamonds from 2003 by the Canadian poet Christian Bock, and it consists of small stanzas like a mosaic of fragments set in a monospace font, Panoptica by Nick Shin, that was designed specifically for this purpose. Each line in each verse is the same number of characters. So setting it unjustified, it appears justified as the lines align. It's a great example of text made to fit the typography. On another page, 26 characters make up each line, of course, the alphabet. I'm thinking this must be really hard to do. And of course, I'd love to see a book that does this on every line of every page. And what a job that would be to do. Although unjustified text setting became kind of accepted in the 50s and 60s, it wasn't really until, for short form work, it wasn't really until the advent of desktop publishing in the mid-80s that more wild things started to happen, really because the designer was now the typesetter. And the designer was able to test out and execute innovative forms more economically and faster and quicker. This is an example of the telephone book. Well, the book's called The Telephone Book. It's not actually a telephone book. It's called The Telephone Book, designed by Richard Eckersley in 1989. He played out different approaches to text setting with each chapter. He writes, "At first you may find the way the book runs to be disturbing, but we had to break up its logic typographically. Like the electronic impulse, it's flooded with signals." So, the text is left aligned, it's also right aligned, but it's also justified when combined. And you've got this giant river of white, something as students we were always told to avoid, crashing through the middle of the page. Actually, when you look at it really, you'll notice the text is actually justified, with the white line making it appear unjustified. Emigre magazine from 1992 This issue focuses on the work from CalArts as a sort of wilder example, the page playing out all options of text setting within one spread. Again, typesetting is really taken to extreme with this kind of postmodern at its best, but really it's playing out with these ideas of justification, unjustification on the same line itself. Yeah, on the right-hand page, it's actually happening on the same line. You've got justification, unjustification, justification. A kind of more sober approach from issue 24 from 1992. And again, revisiting these kind of issues is interesting, as essentially they're kind of playing out all these different forms of typesetting. And if you kind of get over the fact that they're from the 90s, there's some really, really interesting ideas happening. Of course, in my practice, I will kind of lift those ideas and use it for this job, which is called Inscription. And again, it's a journal of material text theory and practice. And as you can imagine, finding examples of mixing justified and unjustified setting is extremely rare and really difficult to do. You can't just do a Google image search of justified and unjustified setting. It doesn't get you anywhere. And as far as I know, there is not a museum of unjustified or justified setting. I feel like I might want to set one up, and there's not even an archive of unjustified or justified setting. While studying microtypography for this research, I've noticed a kind of principle emerging from Switzerland. It's kind of spreading to Germany, Italy in the south, bit of France, not quite the north of France, but definitely the south of France, but definitely not England. This idea of creating an equal and crafted rhythm of typeset paragraphs. Time spent on this zigzag, the Flattersatz, I think I've pronounced that right, is taken to an extreme in-out effect by altering the overall tracking of a line. And the horizontal vertical stretch, or the compression of the font, or the size of the font, these adjustments are subtle and not really noticeable to the human eye. That's the idea. They can't detect them. The designers are striving for nonchalance. If the line endings are not done, it is felt by many that the designer hasn't cared for or crafted the text. This form of line endings on the example here is the complete opposite to what I was taught at the University of Reading in the 1990s, and I still very much practice today. This kind of idea of a fuzzy D. You can see it in the red. The space at the top and the bottom of each paragraph gives the reader a clue of a separate paragraph. And this feels correct to me, the English way. And I would have spent a great deal of care and laboured hours over these line endings. But when I show this work to my fellow designers overseas, they are horrified at my lack of care. But really, it comes down to a subjective choice and the intention of the designer. And to the level, at which this is performed is down to the line length, personal preferences, what the text is, what language is. Are we going to use hyphenation or not hyphenation? And different designers have slightly different tricks and tolerances to make this kind of happen, to make it look like nothing has happened. This is an example from Lucas Lucini, a student project. And he created a kind of parody of this obsessive Swiss style of in-out setting, taking it a step further by automating it, using an embedded box on alternate lines to create the in-out, but actually setting the type justified. It's the best and the worst of justified and unjustified setting happening at the same time. It's an in-joke to those in the know. It's a fun and novel approach. It's efficient to produce, but it's unjustified with variable letter and word spacing. That's really noticeable to me. Kai Tashibahu, I can never pronounce his name, apologies Kai, created a really more extreme version to visually interpret the text. And this seems more successful as it's more intentional and actually the setting is more even. And lastly, to the Swiss designers Norm, who created a subtle and super precise iteration of the same idea in 2019 with 1, 2, 3, 4 points where the line can justify to in a repeating sequential way that looks natural, but it's purely mechanical, justified and unjustified. Gillian Cashin's recent research project, Alternative Layout System, finds new ways to deal with the end of the line beyond the standard software choices, with InDesign plugins creating novel ways of dealing with this problem. What's interesting to me here is the automation of these tasks. Script 5, fill the space, is also a technique found in manuscripts, such as this Litany of the Saints Book of Hours dating from 1460 from France. Script 5 on the right, hyphenator, reduces the last letter of the last word on a line so it can fit in and become justified. Similar to that of Gill, nearly a century ago. And just when I thought I couldn't find any examples of justified and unjustified happening today that follow the exact same manner of Bayer, here is the Amazon Kindle. It's an electronic reading application that allows the user to change the typeface, the size, and the justification settings. At a large size, when it's justified, rather than breaking a word with a hyphen or having an awkward, widely spaced line, the word is taken over and that initial line remains unjustified. So it does exist in today's world. It's actually a really clever solution, and it really works for this device in this situation. And for a lot of people, they maybe don't even notice what's going on. Maybe that's the joy of this design. It's likely that this decision's maybe been made by a coder or someone with a basic knowledge of typesetting, as combining these two methods is not normally an option. Of course, you can't set it in the screen, I should hasten to add. You set it to justified, and it does this at a certain size. Historical, theoretical, technical reasons would deem this really illogical, but it does really work for this device with this setting at this size. So back to Bayer, I've kind of discussed some historical examples in the field, and these are often made by typographic writers and designers in control of the content and the look, or those with, applying these in-jokes to visually interpret their text. Since the mid-1980s, these decisions are firmly in the hand of the designer, responsible for micro-typesetting and crafting what happens at the end of a line within a typographic discourse. I'm just going to end, returning to Bayer, with his hope for the future and my hope for the future that we're in, with new styles hopefully expecting to appear. This presentation is focused on a very niche situation within micro-typography. If any of you are aware of further examples, then I would love to hear from you. If there are any coders amongst you that would like to work with me to develop an InDesign plugin to enable this to happen, then please do get in touch with me at the following 3 computer ways. Thank you very much.